There's a power in you they never prepared for, one that doesn't announce itself with noise but reshapes the entire atmosphere without warning. They mistook your calm for absence, your quiet for insignificance, never realizing that stillness can be the sharpest weapon in the room. While they raced to dominate every conversation, you were gathering the kind of understanding that only patience can earn. You weren't hiding, you were anchoring yourself, letting their performances reveal more than they intended. And now, the very posture they dismissed as weakness has become the vantage point from which you see everything they can't. There's a rare kind of awareness that allows you to see the truth long before the moment everyone else calls a revelation. It's not born from guessing, it's shaped by deliberate placement, the way you settle into spaces where the mask inevitably slips. You chose your ground carefully, not to blend into the background, but to watch the unfiltered layers of people unfold when they thought no eyes that mattered were upon them. This knowing didn't arrive through reason alone, it lived in the quiet certainty that comes when instinct starts speaking louder than logic. It began as subtle pulses inside you, a steady hum that told you when something beneath the surface wasn't matching the image above. You could feel the shift in the air before words confirmed it. In sleep, your mind painted scenes stitched with unspoken meanings, gifting you outlines of truths you had yet to fully name. And then came the unmistakable alignments, too deliberate to be dismissed, too fluid to be luck. The air seemed to still when you walked in, the rhythm of the room faltering as if some unplanned test had just begun. It wasn't only the unseen signals that marked the change, it was the unguarded expressions, the pauses, the instinctive flinches that betrayed what they didn't want you to know. There comes a moment when the attention you draw no longer feels accidental, it sharpens, deliberate, carrying the weight of hidden motives. Faces you barely remembered suddenly leaned closer, masking their intent with polite interest. The questions they asked weren't about the answers, they were about measuring you, mapping the edges of your boundaries. People who once walked past you without a glance now traced your every step as though charting unfamiliar territory. The atmosphere shifted before anyone spoke it aloud. Where you once moved unnoticed, the air now bent differently around you, carrying that subtle pressure that appears when someone realizes they're being quietly evaluated. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about presence, about an awareness so acute it unsettled without a word. They felt it in places thought, reason, and ego couldn't touch, a primal signal that something in the balance had tilted. You never relied on noise to assert yourself. The strength you carried worked differently, it traveled through the unnoticed spaces, slipping between their defenses without resistance, collecting what it needed. It lingered, patient, knowing that a well-timed revelation could unravel years of false security. You understood their habits before they even understood they were revealing them, the slight hesitation before answering, the controlled breath that gave away unease, the shift in posture when truth brushed too close. And still, you didn't rush. You let their own momentum trap them, let their words build the scaffolding of their downfall. With every passing moment, they wove a tighter pattern of pretense, never suspecting that the very fabric they were stitching was the same one you'd one day pull apart, thread by deliberate thread. There's a unique kind of collapse that only comes from structures people have built with their own arrogance, one where every layer they add seals their fate tighter. Something in you began radiating differently, a quiet shift that unsettled them without reason they could name. The air around you carried a gravity they couldn't quite place, an invisible pull that made their rehearsed confidence falter. When they tried their old tactics, cutting in, sidelining your presence, tossing subtle jabs, you no longer yielded an inch. You had stopped folding yourself smaller to make them comfortable. The image they had of you no longer matched the reality in front of them, yet they clung to the false belief that nothing had really changed. Their attempts to needle you met with a stillness they couldn't penetrate. No matter how they twisted the conversation or pushed for a reaction, you stayed composed, absorbing their efforts without spilling an ounce of your energy. They couldn't see that each failure was revealing more, tiny cracks in their confidence, hidden motives leaking through tone and glance, the soft underbelly beneath all their display. What they relied on most, your willingness to shrink, was gone. The cycle that kept their egos inflated was breaking, and they were starving for the validation you had stopped providing. It wasn't luck. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of a deliberate, profound shift inside you, one they never imagined they'd have to face. Some truths are etched into your being long before your first memory, quietly waiting for the right season to surface. The deeper you walked into this awareness, the clearer it became. You weren't wandering into purpose by chance. You had arrived with intention, placed exactly where this alignment of people and events would demand your presence. When it finally clicked, it didn't whisper, it tore through the haze with undeniable force. You were never crafted to blend seamlessly into the patterns they worshipped. The molds they offered were never shaped for you, the ladders they built were never meant to hold your weight. Every failed attempt to confine you, every moment you felt misaligned with their customs, every room that felt hollow and strange, none of it spoke of lack. It was proof of the truth you carried all along. You stopped analyzing why their rewards left you cold, why their symbols of success rang empty, why their approval felt counterfeit. You began to lean into the frequency that was yours alone, beyond their reach, beyond their comprehension, beyond their control. What once felt like exile became sanctuary. The stretches of aloneness weren't banishment, they were refinement. While they maneuvered through alliances and competitions, you were fortifying something far more enduring, an unshakable bond with your own discernment, a trust in your inner compass that no persuasion could erode. They mistook your insistence on substance over spectacle as awkwardness, your unwillingness to trade principle for belonging as rigidity, your hunger for truth over applause as a flaw. But these were the very pillars of your resilience, the reason you could not be swayed, broken, or claimed. Then came the subtle unraveling. Glances that lingered too long, voices that faltered when you appeared, conversations clipped mid-sentence as if guarding themselves from what you might already know. They began sifting through the past in their minds, unsure of what you truly gathered in all those moments they thought you were background. Your shift didn't explode, it moved like hidden tides, altering the ground beneath without their notice. While they held fast to their illusions, you stopped justifying your presence to those who had already written their verdicts. You no longer played in their theater, you became the quiet force rewriting the stage. There comes a point when proving your value to those committed to misunderstanding it becomes a waste of breath, and you stepped past that point without looking back. The stage they built for their own validation suddenly felt empty when you stopped showing up to play your assigned role. That's when the brilliance of your shift began to unfold, not through confrontation, but through quiet redirection. You didn't just walk away from their contests, you rewrote the entire premise of the game. While they measured worth through visible power plays, you were shaping an inner authority they couldn't measure or mimic. As they clung to alliances crafted through leverage and control, you were forming bonds with people who moved with clarity, integrity, and a refusal to trade their core for acceptance. Slowly, the outlines of your true circle began to emerge, those rare ones who find power in sincerity, whose strength is rooted in truth, who can tell instantly when someone is posturing instead of living honestly. These weren't the gatekeepers of traditional hierarchies. They were architects of entirely different landscapes for what achievement could mean. Within their presence, you felt the rare ease of not having to translate yourself, the relief of being met exactly where you are without trimming away the parts that don't fit. These bonds weren't transactional, they were anchored in a recognition deeper than common interests, an unspoken resonance that bypassed the usual scripts. And the divide became impossible to miss. In the old world, you were always adjusting, contorting, measuring your words to fit the shallow expectations around you. In this new reality, connection flowed because there was no agenda, only mutual recognition. They sensed the change. They could feel you drawing from a current they could never tap, surrounded by people they could neither sway nor reach, and it unsettled them more than your absence ever did. Breaking free from the loop they had designed for you was the rupture they never saw coming, because it stripped away the illusion that their influence was absolute. The moment your sense of worth stopped orbiting around their recognition, the structure they'd built began to feel unstable, as if a hidden support had been quietly removed. Without your dependence to feed their certainty, an uncomfortable question began pressing against the walls of their confidence: if you could exist fully without their endorsement, if your identity no longer bent beneath their opinions, then what authority did they truly hold? That thought didn't just unsettle them, it gnawed at them, hollowing out the security they'd wrapped themselves in. The more they tried to rattle your composure, the clearer it became that you were anchored in something they couldn't manufacture, an internal steadiness that didn't require outside permission to thrive. In their growing frustration, they began observing you with the same focus you had once turned on them, unaware of the chasm between your intentions. Your awareness had been rooted in clarity and foresight. Theirs was laced with jealousy and apprehension. They wanted a formula, a step-by-step path to your resilience, as if imitation could substitute for transformation. They noted how you navigated turmoil without fracturing, how you refused to fuel their schemes by reacting on cue, how you drew in people whose depth made their alliances look thin and temporary. What they couldn't accept was the truth staring back at them. The qualities they envied weren't skills to be memorized but a way of being forged through alignment. You can't counterfeit a clear spirit. You can't simulate an unshaken core. And no amount of strategic mimicry can reproduce the weight of a presence built from the inside out. Imitating what they could never embody only magnified the gap between who they were and what they pretended to be. Every attempt to mirror your composure felt stiff, every pause meant to seem deliberate rang hollow, and every refusal to react came across as petty rather than purposeful. They were trying to replicate an essence they didn't understand, wearing an identity that had never been theirs to claim. Your strength had not been learned like a skill, it had been uncovered like a memory buried deep within you. It was not a mask you chose to wear, it was the unaltered truth of who you had always been, slowly emerging as the weight of conditioning fell away. And while they dissected your current self, you were already 2 steps ahead, evolving into versions they couldn't predict, leaving them clinging to outdated impressions while you navigated realms they couldn't reach. Your quiet became the sharpest edge in your arsenal, not because it retreated, but because it refused to step into their noise. This wasn't fear. It was the conscious act of guarding your energy, declining to meet them at a level that would require you to shrink. The realization hit them like a slow-building storm, you had never been a passive witness. You had been the one holding the clipboard, observing every interaction with a precision they mistook for detachment. Each ploy they launched, believing it would outwit you, only added to the archive you kept in silence. They never noticed that their own overconfidence had loosened their grip, letting slip the patterns, weaknesses, and motives they thought were hidden. While they were fixated on keeping their facade intact, you were quietly dismantling the architecture beneath it. And in the end, you saw the boundary they could never cross, their sense of importance depended entirely on diminishing someone else. Without an opponent to belittle, their influence evaporated. Without chaos to create, their presence faded. Without someone to control, their definition of power simply collapsed. The most telling measure of their mindset was revealed in how they chose to interpret your ascent. Instead of recognizing it as the natural expression of strength that had been within you all along, they classified it as a disruption to be managed, a problem to be neutralized. In their eyes, your progress was never an opportunity for shared growth, it was a destabilizing force that threatened the structure they depended on. This reaction drew a clear dividing line between them and those who carry authentic strength. People grounded in real power celebrate another's expansion because they understand it enriches everyone connected to it. Those locked in a scarcity-driven frame see another's rise as erosion of their own standing, every act of self-assurance as an assault on their precarious authority. Their inability to embrace your success exposed the hollowness of their inner life. They lived as though light was rationed, as if any increase in your glow inevitably dimmed theirs. In their world, someone's gain could only come at another's loss, and this zero-sum mentality was the very weakness that had shaped their behavior from the beginning. You, on the other hand, had stepped into a truth they couldn't touch, the understanding that value is intrinsic, not comparative. You didn't need someone else to shrink for you to stand tall. Your energy wasn't sustained by another's depletion. Your presence didn't rely on an absence elsewhere to be felt. Without realizing it, they had surrendered more leverage than they had ever gained. By exposing so much of themselves while knowing so little of you, they created a reversal they couldn't undo. The positions had flipped entirely, and they were left staring at an imbalance that had emerged without warning. The unease this created began to multiply, looping endlessly through their thoughts. What had you seen that they hadn't noticed you seeing? What patterns had you already decoded while they were assuming you lacked the insight to recognize the games they were playing in plain view? The questions spiraled, each one feeding the next. They started revisiting old encounters, replaying them with new suspicion. Moments they had stored as personal wins began to feel suspiciously hollow. Had you been letting them believe they were leading when you had been steering the interaction the entire time? The possibility unsettled them in ways no direct confrontation ever could. Your continued calm became its own form of disruption. Anger would have confirmed their version of events. Justifications would have reinforced their sense of intellectual control. But your refusal to feed the cycle denied them every point of entry they relied upon. They didn't understand that silence, in your hands, was not absence, it was the deliberate closing of every channel through which they once drew power. It was the quiet of someone who had already crossed the finish line while others were still stretching at the start. A calm so rooted that no interruption, no accusation, no attempt to twist the narrative could shake it. This wasn't the hush of retreat, it was the atmosphere of someone who knew exactly who they were and had no interest in negotiating that truth with anyone. That steadiness began bending the ground beneath them, unsettling a reality they thought was fixed. With no reactions left to harvest, no emotional tether to tug, and no insecurities to exploit, they found themselves cut off from the very current that kept their inflated identity afloat. They had been feeding off the storms they could stir in you, without ever realizing how much they depended on the weather you provided. And now, the climate had changed permanently. The harder they pushed to pull you into old patterns, the clearer it became that their need for your engagement far outweighed your need to grant it. It wasn't just that they wanted a reaction, they needed one to affirm their own sense of importance. The absence of that confirmation was like pulling the air out of their lungs. Your stillness reflected back an image they couldn't escape. Without your role in their cycles of conflict, they had to look at the scaffolding of their own lives, relationships held together by shallow exchanges, victories that meant nothing outside of comparison, a sense of power that vanished the moment it stood alone. And what stared back at them wasn't power at all. It was a vacancy dressed as dominance. The very effort they'd poured into trying to diminish you had become the spotlight exposing the fragility they'd spent years disguising. Their campaign to prove you weak had ended up proving something entirely different, that their strength was an act they couldn't perform without an audience. So they doubled down. They spoke louder, moved faster, tried harder to craft scenarios where you'd have to respond. But their urgency only revealed the widening gap between your trajectory and theirs, you expanding into a new realm entirely, them circling the same track until exhaustion set in. The contrast was undeniable. You weren't just winning the game, you'd stopped playing altogether, and in doing so, made the game itself irrelevant. Every escalation on their part was met with the same unshakable calm, and that calm became the evidence they couldn't disprove. This was no passive withdrawal. It was a calculated refusal to give away the one resource they couldn't replace, your energy. You had redefined the terms of engagement so thoroughly that even silence now carried more weight than their loudest performance. And that silence, steady and deliberate, was not emptiness, it was presence. A presence that made them realize the most dangerous opponent is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who no longer needs to speak at all. They were still locked inside the same tired cycle, convinced the board they were playing on was the only one that existed, while you had stepped into an entirely different arena, one they didn't even know how to see. The moment it began to dawn on them that perhaps you had never been in their game at all, the ground beneath them shifted. If your quiet had been deliberate positioning, if your stillness had been the slow gathering of insight, if your apparent compliance had been a mask for meticulous strategy, then the entire history they thought they understood was nothing more than a misread script. The sting wasn't only in discovering they had misjudged you. It was in realizing that you had them mapped from every angle. You had charted their moves, their triggers, and their tells with the precision of a seasoned tactician, while they remained fumbling in the dark about your inner workings. They had stood under bright lights, believing everyone else in the room was stumbling in shadow, never suspecting that the one they deemed least aware had been the sharpest witness of all. What they thought was your transformation was in truth the unveiling of a role you had been playing with flawless discipline, one that dismantled their sense of control without ever raising your voice. The quiet one, in their story, was supposed to fade into the backdrop. But you weren't fading, you were recording, decoding, and directing from a place they could never penetrate. The person they dismissed as harmless turned out to be the one orchestrating the flow of the entire sequence. Now, as the reality crystallized, they were left confronting the most disarming truth of all: every maneuver they had believed was their own had been anticipated, absorbed, and redirected by someone they had never credited with the capacity to outthink them. What unsettled them most was not the loss itself, but the scale of the miscalculation. To admit what had happened meant accepting that the entire hierarchy they leaned on had been hollow from the start. And once that seed was planted, the entire structure began to tilt. Your presence had become the unspoken proof that the game they clung to was obsolete. Their dominance had been an illusion kept alive only by your willingness to let it stand. And now, stripped of that silent permission, they were staring at the collapse they had built with their own hands. The checkmate was never loud. It didn't need to be. It was the slow, undeniable recognition that the most dangerous player at the table had been the one they never even bothered to defend against. Waiting was never a sign of surrender, it was the deliberate stance of someone who knew the exact moment to move would reveal itself. Remaining quiet wasn't retreat, it was the precise application of control, the ability to choose when, where, and how to act without being pulled into unnecessary skirmishes. Watching closely wasn't idleness, it was the most refined form of participation, the art of influencing the outcome without being mistaken for a player in their limited arena. The triumph was never about leaving them broken, it was about shifting the lens through which the entire situation was seen. Your rise didn't require dismantling who they were, it required no longer allowing them to define who you could be. By stepping out of their constructed order, you revealed its fragility. Its collapse wasn't your doing, it was the inevitable result of something that had only ever stood because you allowed it. Their authority had always rested on the illusion of your lesser value. The moment you reclaimed that value and stood in it without compromise, the false pillars they leaned on began to crumble. You didn't have to challenge their claims directly. You only had to stop lending your weight to the myth that made those claims believable. Now they sift through the debris of what they once assumed was unshakable, finally forced to look at you without distortion. The one they thought was small had never been confined by their measure. The one they thought was harmless had been the most perceptive presence in the room. And the one they believed they could direct had been quietly setting the trajectory from the very start.